I'm Mat Broome. I'm a art director here at Sony Online, and I'm in charge of characters on the entire project. And what that involves is creating the characters and editing for real time, which basically means making sure that all the characters are on screen drawing properly and that they're aesthetically pleasing. Yeah, I mean, outside of testing, I was on another project here at SOE during that time, Sovereign, which is another project we had in development. So I didn't work on PlanetSide, I just helped test it. But I did play the original, yeah, a lot of it. I think the coolest thing about PlanetSide 2 was we had an art director, Tremel Isaac, who had already worked on the first one. So instead of having an art director who had to get up to speed on a franchise, we had somebody who already had worked on the original franchise, who was already close to the original, and was excited about doing a sequel. So by the time the rest of us got assembled on the project, it was actually nice because all the reference to find it. PlanetSide has an incredible online community already that's been with the project for 11 years. So actually internally, I went to a lot of fan sites and started getting a lot of reference on what the original looked like, because a lot of the data and sites that they had done were in some cases better than what we even had internally. Yeah, I mean, it's the number of players on a map. You have thousands of people on one map. So logistically, it's the hardest game I've ever worked on. And technically, it's probably the hardest game I've ever worked on. Before this, I did DC Universe Online, and we had the challenge of getting that to work on a PlayStation with the memory limitations. But on PlanetSide 2, you've got such a significant amount of players, all PvP, player versus player, and they're doing things, you know, in relation to what the server is doing that is it's incredibly complex. It's the most complex game I've ever worked on. Honestly, I think it's the character system. I think the big thing is in PlanetSide, what we have to deal with that no other shooter has to deal with is we have 3 factions instead of 2. And it might not sound like, you know, divisible by 1 more, it's that much, but it's actually technically really hard to pull off because all of them can't share characteristics or aesthetics. And in addition to that, you have to draw this number 3 times larger on massive maps. So with the fighting ranges as distant as they are, you know, they average over 130 meters out. You're dealing with characters, you know, being recognizable by class at great distances in terrain that is often not flat. So I think the crowning achievement for not just me, but the, you know, the whole art team really, is that we're able to get these characters to draw properly on screen, lend themselves to 3 different environments at launch, and be aesthetically distinguishable enough to actually be able to recognize in game. Because when you're fighting in divisions of 3, your decision making, you know, in milliseconds is just much more complex because you're not just looking at one enemy. You have to distinguish 2 because we do have friendly fire in the game. So it introduces another layer of complexity. So I think the proudest achievement for sure is the amount of work that went in behind the scenes to get that balance right. Yeah, that's a really good question. The challenge really comes from on original PlanetSide there were 3. And so it was never even a real discussion to have anything less than 3. Because it was again all about making sure that we represented the original brand. The original brand had unique vehicles for every single faction. It had 3 factions in total. It had, you know, even more classes. You know, some which people absolutely hate that we'll leave out of discussion that aren't coming back. But each one of them has 6 classes, 18, you have 18 classes in total for 3 different factions. So the challenge really was in a modern day aesthetic, how do you pull that off? Especially with this being a sci-fi military style game. And that was really the toughest thing, was our play distance because of our 8K by 8K maps is much more difficult than Call of Duty and even Battlefield 3. I'm an avid FPS player. I actually play FPSs more than anything. And with the more realistic lighting conditions that we have now that the original PlanetSide didn't have, a lot of times you're blending your palette against very realistic backdrops, against very dense fields of players. So it's one thing just to distinguish the enemy, it's also you have to distinguish your own players, which on our maps has a tendency of being up to 90 or 100 people running around you. And you're really just seeing them in milliseconds as they're running between vehicles and, you know, sunderers, and you're only getting snippets. Actually, I actually got started in this field when I met somebody from Sony Online years ago. I had my own company before here, and we did a lot of work in Hollywood and film and in the comic and publishing space. And I met somebody from Sony Online, because Sony Online was one of my clients before I came here. And at that time I was getting married and thinking about settling down, and they were talking about this game called Sovereign. And I was a huge RTS player. I mean, just rabid RTS player. And they're, well, we're working on this game that's like, it's a military game, it's got 3 different factions, you know, it's an RTS, it's a real-time game, you have 7 planets, you can zoom in on each planet and fight anywhere real-time, go to 3D, and I just was blown away. So when I first came here, I actually came to work on Sovereign. And then Sovereign got canceled because of the complexity of the game. So when PlanetSide came up, PlanetSide is very similar to Sovereign with the third-person perspective, but it's very similar. Even the metagame and where it's going is very similar to the original Sovereign. First games I worked on was actually before I even started at Sony, I worked on a StarCraft expansion out of a small company in Utah that did a lot of their DLC or downloadable content. And then after that I worked on a race game for Sony Online, a third-party race game. And then when I came here I worked on Sovereign. Those are the first games that I worked on. Learned a lot. You learn a lot when you work on your first games. I wouldn't say didn't care for. I think there have been games. There's one game I worked on, it's actually a prototype called Ancient Glory. And it wasn't that I didn't like Ancient Glory, I just knew that it was going to be technically very hard to pull it off. It was a kind of a sword fighting game with the third-person camera. And those are always going to be difficult because anytime you have a sword fighting game, it's really about balancing and making combat feel good. Combat is already hard to feel good, even just with projectiles and FPSs. But making a sword fighting game specifically, it's almost like trying to find the right boxing game. No matter how good they are, it still doesn't really feel like I'm boxing. It just kind of feels like I'm button mashing with the controller. So I wouldn't say I didn't enjoy it because I learned a lot about making games in milliseconds, MMOs in milliseconds. So it was a great learning experience, but it was probably one of the most challenging projects I've ever worked on because of the amount of time that went into R&D. There's a lot of R&D before we ever even got to vertical slice, which for people who don't know what vertical slice means, it's basically a working prototype of what the game is and what the design itself will actually represent the day you ship the title. You don't really, it's kind of funny because the MMO community has a tendency of being smarter. And I don't mean that in a way to actually insult anybody else, but the 2 smartest environments that I've been in are MMOs and first-person shooters. First-person shooters are probably people that could build rocket ships in their spare time or work for SpaceX. And it's just some of the smartest people I've ever played with, like in TeamSpeak. And actually a lot of times you run into people who really know their stuff from a technical standpoint, how to squeeze every frame out of their machine that they're overclocking. MMOs is much the same. I think a lot of MMO players are designers by heart. I think they don't just play the games, I think they think the games. So, I mean, even now I play PlanetSide in beta every single night. I play with TRG, which is one of the original guilds, or original outfits, not guilds, outfits that ran in the original one. Some of the smartest guys you ever played with. They're sitting there really coming up with knowledgeable things, some of which that have even influenced the team on the forums and the boards, which is why our community is so important on PlanetSide. But no, there's some pretty smart players out there in these 2 genres for sure. Day-to-day basis is really about the characters. Like right now at this stage, we're going into ship. So everything now is about post-launch content. So it's about the customization of characters. It's about different skull masks they'll wear, different masks and accoutrements they'll wear. It's about the alternate outfits and stuff like that we're talking about. It's really about what's next post-launch. Things that people can do to customize their characters, make them look like individuals, make their outfits look unique from the rest of the players in the world. So, to answer the general part of the question, what I do on a daily basis is really come in and try to figure out not just how to make that look pretty, but how to get it to technically work and how to make sure that whatever things that we're designing and actually doing for the game can work with what we already have and what we want to make in the future, 2 and 3 years down the road. I think the biggest thing is just do what you love. I think if you want to be in the industry, you should play a lot of games. You know, it's just like any other profession. You know, the more you do it, the more you'll learn about it by experience. I don't think games are any different. I actually think games are more applicable to that than just about anything else I can think of outside of you know, illustration and programming. So the best thing is, you know, get knowledgeable, you know, take advantage of the internet. There's a lot of information online. There's a lot of engines you can get access to for free. There's a lot of games you can mod. I think the chances of actually doing this, you know, just by learning through experience are better than they've ever been. PlanetSide 2 is by far, as an avid first-person shooter, the best shooter I've ever played in my life. What PlanetSide gives you that no other shooter I've ever played gives you is a true sense of massive war. It's the first MMO FPS I've ever played, including the original, where at any given time you go through multiple winning mechanics, from conquest to rush style mechanics to really a tug of war type of system where you're not only fighting to win the base, you're fighting to keep it and gain influence and ultimately win a continent that's as large as AK by AK. What is incredibly unique about PlanetSide over any other game I've played is that there's a true persistence and a true ongoing war and struggle that actually rewards the players on an individual level while playing with hundreds of people.